We're looking at two magisterial examples of apologetics at the height of Christendom as examples of what we are calling epic apologetics, a sort of apologetic strategy that seeks to tell a bigger and better story. In the last video, we looked at Augustine and how Augustine responds in City of God to the challenge that Christianity is responsible for the fall of Rome. In this video, we look at another giant of the Western tradition, Aquinas. The challenge faced by Aquinas was religious pluralism in the form of Christianity's confrontation with Islam. Christianity's universal scope and intellectual erudition had worked well in converting the barbarian tribes. But in Islam, Christianity encountered another worldwide, totalizing religion with impressive intellectual accomplishments of its own. Islamic philosophers would argue with Christians by quoting Aristotle. In response to a letter written by Ramon of Peñaforte, Aquinas wrote a handbook for missionaries working in Muslim Spain. These missionaries chose mission work over crusade, and the name of this work is Summa Contra Gentiles, against the Gentiles. Now, in this work, Aquinas distinguishes between two kinds of divine truths. One which operates by means of demonstrative arguments, by reason, and one which operates by means of the authority of Scripture. He writes, "One kind of divine truth, the investigation of reason, is competent to reach, whereas the other surpasses every effort of reason." In other words, there are things that we can know about God through reason, and there are things that can only be known about God through revelation. Aquinas' argument is divided into 4 parts. In the first 3 parts, books 1 through 3, Aquinas joins his challengers on their own ground. He cites Aristotle, he cites Islamic philosophers, and he focuses on what can be known about God, humanity, and God's relationship with the world. It is highly technical, but part of Aquinas' goal is to build up confidence in the shared resource of reason. Aquinas is not a hyper-rationalist, but he does believe that reason is generally reliable, similar to a compass. He writes, "If the only way open to us for the knowledge of God were solely that of reason, the human race would remain in the blackest shadows of ignorance. It is useful for the human reason to exercise itself in such arguments, however weak they may be, provided only that there be present no presumption to comprehend or to demonstrate. For to be able to see something of the loftiest realities, however thin and weak the sight may be, is a cause of greatest joy." At the same time, notice that Aquinas is constantly alerting us to the limitations of human reason. He shows that Christian and Muslim arguments, such as about the eternity of the world, lack absolute and necessary conclusiveness. In other words, neither side can conclusively persuade one another by the shared authority of reason alone. Instead of attempting to conclusively demonstrate the superiority of the Christian argument, Aquinas shifts to focusing on the sort of picture that each religion paints. Here again, he does this because of the limitations of their shared method. The tragic situation of both Christian and Muslim philosophers is that they run into the tragic limitations of human knowledge. He writes, "There is abundant evidence of how even the most brilliant minds of these men suffered from the narrowness of their viewpoints." So in Book 4, Aquinas shifts from reason to revelation, to Scripture and the Christian story. And for Aquinas, as for Augustine, his focus is on the centrality of the Incarnation. He writes, "It now remains to speak of the Incarnation itself. Indeed, among divine works, this most especially exceeds the reason, for nothing can be thought of which is more marvelous than this divine accomplishment, that the true God, the Son of God, should become true man. And because among them all it is most marvelous, it follows that toward faith in this particular marvel, all other miracles are ordered." Aquinas argues that just as creation is a free act of God's generosity, so too the Incarnation is a superabundant act of God's freedom. God is no longer just the first cause. but also the loving Father, who unites the mind's desire for knowledge and the heart's desire to love God. This knowledge is not merely abstract, but personal and experiential. This is what God gives us in the Incarnation. So let's take a step back and talk about Aquinas' strategy. Aquinas enters the challenger's story, answers it on its own terms, unveils core flaws and desires, and then shows how Christianity offers a more satisfying and capacious story. Finally, let's note some common threads between these two thinkers, Augustine and Aquinas. Both are interested in the relationship of faith and reason, of Christian faith and human culture, philosophy, and poetry. Both recognize a certain amount of common ground that is shared, at least common desires that philosophy and poetry are trying to satisfy. These might be desires for enlightenment, or peace, or justice, or truth. At the same time, both recognize the limitations of this common ground and grant a certain amount of incommensurability between rival visions of the world. The idea that some things can only be understood from the inside. Both also share a similar strategy: to enter the challenger's objection, to enter the challenger's story, and answer it using sources and arguments that would be respected by them. Answer it on its own terms. Both are also sensitive to the desires that lie underneath the philosophy, which is to say that they are sensitive not just to the intellect, but also to the imagination and the affections. Finally, both seek to retell a better story, showing how the desire for justice and peace and knowledge and truth is satisfied in the bigger, more beautiful story of the incarnation and redemptive action of Jesus Christ. This is the heart of epic apologetics: to understand the stories that our culture is telling, and then to enter them with a more capacious and beautiful story, a story that challenges, but also a story that fulfills.